At dawn the sea wore the color of beaten copper, and the dunes beyond it glimmered as if each grain of sand had been licked by a secret flame. The prow of the flagship slit the swells like a knife through ripe figs. Above the masts, turning in slow circles on the ribbed blue air, Drogon measured the shore with a predator's patience. Regal and Viserion swept farther out, their wing beats the breath of some submerged god. Every few strokes their shadows rippled across the water and ran up the pale stones of the coast, where goat paths threaded between thornbush and date palm toward the spear tips of Sunspear. Daenerys stood bareheaded in the wind. The salt had turned her hair coarse and stiff, and her cheeks ached from the brightness coming off the water. She tasted lemon, she thought, though there was none to taste. Only the memory of a sour bite from some forgotten city and the sudden, startling perfume that drifted from the land. The smell of oranges came ashore with the breeze and made the heat feel generous, not cruel. "We are seen," Varys said beside her. His robes tugged backward by the wind as if an invisible hand would keep him from setting foot on Dorne at all. Word flies more quickly than ravens when it rides on the desire of a people. "They have desired vengeance," Tyrion answered, leaning on the rail. A gull sailed the length of his gaze and vanished. "No one ever eats their fill of it." Daenerys did not answer at once. She watched as Dornish sails rose from the sheltered inlets like a flock startled from its roost. Half a dozen long, low galleys cutting out into the deeper water, their oars flashing. They were scouts as much as escort, banners snapping. The sun and spear in orange and red, a saffron pennon with a forked tail, the tawny boar of House Ironwood. A bolder ship peeled toward them, the men bare to the waist and shining with oil. They sang as they rowed. A woman's voice came with them, carried whole on the sea and seeming to come from the water itself, braiding itself around the creak of rigging and the dragon's distant keening. The woman sang of rainies and mare axes, and of a bolt that struck a dragon's eye so cleanly that those who saw it went to their graves convinced that Dorne had made a covenant with accuracy. Daenerys listened until the song threaded into the wash of waves. She glanced up. Drogon was looking too, head canted, one pupil narrowing. She laid her palm against the warm pitch of the rail. The ship's deck rose, fell, rose. "I have come for justice," she said, "not vengeance. Many in this land make no distinction between the two," Varys murmured. "They will learn it," Daenerys said. Her voice felt like a blade she had sharpened herself, uncomfortably honest. "Or they will fear it." When their keel kissed the sand at last and the gangplank struck down, the heat came up as if the land breathed. A file of men in light mail and lacquered helms, with kettle shields on their backs, waited at the foot of the plank. Their captain, not old, not young, bowed with an exact formality that made the gesture feel like a bargain. Beyond him the Shadow City shimmered, a humble sprawl of whitewashed bricks and red roofs tucked around the long shadow of the Spear Tower, where the seat of Dorne rose like a statement. "We belong to ourselves." Illyria Sand came down from the dunes wearing grief as jewelry. She moved like smoke but carried herself as if she were something poured from stone. A thin silver chain lay against her throat and held a small glass vial that caught the sun. Her eyes were dark and quick and particular. At her right, Nymeria Sand wore her knives like opinions. At her left, Obara stood with a spear taller than a man, the bronze head idly turning to drink the light. Tyene, smiling, trailed a half-step behind, a lily bloom in a field where everything else glittered harder. The Dornish escort halted 10 paces out. Illyria did not incline her head. "You are far from Dragonstone," she said. "Wise. Those who return to the places they named theirs often find ghosts sitting on the chairs." "Ghosts sit everywhere there are chairs," Tyrion said. "In my experience, even in the privy." Nymeria's mouth twitched. Illyria kept her eyes on Daenerys. "Dorne remembers Elia," she said. "Elia was your brother's joy and our princess. Gregor Clegane mashed her like overripe fruit in the bed where she loved, and your father's name stuck to her bones like ash. The lions won honors and gold and a white cloak for her murderers. We remember." "My brother loved Elia," Daenerys said. She had never met Elia, but she had seen what love could look like when it had weight and consequence. She had felt the shadow of it press on every room where Rhaegar's name was spoken. What was done to her was monstrous. When I sit the Iron Throne, those who ordered and carried out that crime will answer for it if they still draw breath. But I did not come to paint King's Landing with the blood of children. Cersei's children are dead, Ellaria said. The words landed with the indifference of truth. She holds the city with men who call her mother. The city will fight like a brood of snakes around a nest of eggs. Crush it and crush them all. Even the sand snakes will tell you that sometimes you must grind the whole nest into paste if you want to be sure you've killed the right serpent. Her mouth softened. Welcome to Dorne, Your Grace. They walked beneath the fronds and cooing pigeons of the Shadow City. The streets were narrow to keep the sun out, and woven mats hung across from roof to break it into lace. Oranges lay heavy on branches that dipped into courtyards, and children chased each other around the water basins, squealing, slick as fish. Daenerys caught her reflection in one tiled pool, made of small shards of color, blue, green, gold. She looked different in each fragment, a dragon broken into scales. In the water gardens, a coolness rose like an argument against everything outside their walls. The basins stepped down toward the sea, each filled to the lip, overflowing to feed the next. A strong little boy hung with both hands from the lowest branch of a lemon tree, swinging like a bell, too proud to ask the maid beneath him to lift him down. The maid glanced at Daenerys and grinned. "He'll drop before he asks," she said. "It's the Dornish way." Daenerys smiled, and the boy fell with a splash and came up spitting, delighted and furious in equal measure. She remembered a different splash, a different boy floundering in a different fountain, and the taste of fear and the way Yora's hand had wrapped around her forearm. It all had the same sound in her head, the bell note of water struck. Ellaria led them to a shaded hall where the tiles were cool and everything was carved to look like interlaced vines. Bowls of dates and figs and little pastries glistened with syrup. Tyrion ate like a man who had learned that pleasure should not be stored for tomorrow. Varys ate like a man performing his duty to digestion. Grey Worm stood behind Daenerys and did not eat at all. "Your fleet rests at Planky Town," Ellaria said, pouring wine. "The anchorage is safe, the channel's narrow. If a storm comes, we can draw your ships up the river like beads on string and tie them to the willows there. The green blood will hide them with all its bright mud. I have sent riders to Ironwood and Fowler and Dane. Our spears will be in Sunspear by the third day. The Reach sends its roses. Olenna has thorns enough for us all." "Storms are not my only worry," Daenerys said. She looked at the knot of rope coiled on the table, its fibers standing up where it had chafed. "Euron Greyjoy is a storm that steals other storms' names. There are eyes on the horizon," Nymeria said. "We have ships with oars enough to catch a careless wolf. We will not be careless. We learned to fight the sea before the first Targaryen thought to look at us." "Your Grace," Tyrion said, wiping his hands. "Before the sea and the lions have their say, we should have ours. If we make Dragonstone at once, we secure dragonglass and a ready seat from which to stiffen the backs of those lords near the Crownlands who like to be told they have a choice. But we lose Dorne's cover and let Euron choose the ground of any meeting. If we remain in Dorne, we break his teeth when he snaps and we keep our alliance tight in our hands. We risk, however, that Cersei will move on Highgarden before we can knit the roses and the sun together into a net. There is grain enough in the Reach to feed King's Landing through winter. If she seizes it outright, she will starve the rest of the realm to feed herself," Varys finished, as if they were completing a prayer. "She will sit in her castle while the people claw the ground like dogs, and they will love her for giving them scraps she stole." Daenerys laid her hand flat on the cool tile. "We begin here," she said. "We are not Aegon. Aegon burned his way north step by step. Dorne would not bend. I would ask it to stand with me. If we begin by honoring those who honor me, we say what sort of queen I am." Ellaria's eyes glittered. "A queen who remembers Elia. A queen who knows the difference between vengeance and justice," Daenerys said, "and who will not be turned from justice by the convenience of vengeance. Send word to Lady Olenna. Tell her I will meet her soldiers on the border of the Reach. We will break Cersei's hand before it closes on Highgarden. Grey Worm, let your officers choose men who can move by night and climb like thieves. Tyrion, make the Unsullied ready to take Casterly Rock by stealth. If the lion's pride lies in their stone, we will chip it away with knives. Yara will hold the sea between us and King's Landing. Yara slouched in the archway, as if she had been born to lean against doorways and call to ships from the dryness of land. She bowed crookedly. We'll hold it, she said. We keep the wind for us and fire with you at our back. Let him chase us if he dares. Night fell like spilled dye, turning the waters of the green blood a bruised violet under the reeds. Fishermen's lamps bobbed. The insects sang out their 1,000 little weddings in the grass. The first warning came as a skirl of horns from the outer watchtowers, thin and insistent, a mosquito in the ear of the city. Daenerys stood from the maps and cups and walked to the balcony. The horizon had grown teeth. Black shapes like cliffs began to move where there should have been nothing but the steady black of sea. Fires winked and multiplied along their sides. Not the soft scatter of deck lamps, but the narrow, hard glow of braziers banked for pitch and oil. The ships had the ugly grace of predators who lived on rot. They did not bother to hide themselves. They wanted the knowledge of their coming to do half their work. Greyjoy, Yara said, and the name had the shape of contempt in her mouth. She had already shed her sandals. Her feet were silent on tile, and then on the packed earth, and then on the wooden planks that ran down to the water. Tyrion slammed his palm once against the table as if to sound the gavel. Varys, who had lived his life on the edges of screams, listened and said nothing. Illyria's daughters moved like a ripple through grass. Regal, Daenerys whispered. The dragon's answer came as a shudder in the air. Heart to heart, she thought. He finds me before my mind finds him. She did not run to Drogon. She walked, because there were eyes on her from every dark passage and every low doorway. In their faces she saw hunger vanish from thought and be replaced by heat. She saw the moment when fear turned its head toward hoping she would like the way they looked at her. The sea was not an even plain that night. It was a field of machines. Euron's men beat drums that sounded like bodies falling. They sang in time to the drums that they would salt their swords in joy. From the mouth of the green blood their thin channels ran out like fingers, and from those channels Yara's ships came like cats. Quick at first, then faltering, seeing what waited in the road of water. Beyond them upright dragons came down with the wind on their backs. A noise like the world catching its breath and then letting it go in a rush. Daenerys climbed the saddle. Drogon shook himself once and the entire night shook with him. Regal slid in alongside, then Viserion, bright as a ghost above blackness. The first volley from the Ironborn shivered the air. Thick shafts humped forward, scorpion bolts wide as a man's thigh. The sound they made was like a goose's cry drawn out to a scream. The bolts fell short, hissing, and bled bubbles into the river. The second volley stitched the air higher. Beyond them, along the seaward flank, 2 galleys peeled out, their beaks iron-ringed, their decks a cloth of men with shields like black scales. They turned to meet Drogon as if he were a ram to be broken. Daenerys touched the ridge of Drogon's neck and he laughed. It wasn't a sound, but she felt it the way you feel a horse's joy when it turns toward the jump. He folded his wings and fell, then opened them into a sudden flare that made the world tilt. He came past the first galley so low that the rowers' faces were a strip of candlelight to her left, the whites of their eyes briefly as bright as stars. Dracarys, she said, and the word felt ancient in her mouth, salted with 1,000 years' worth of uses. Fire leapt as if the sea were a hearth and Drogon had spat a coal into it. The galley turned instantly into a memory of itself. The fire clung to the oil and then to the men and then to the wood and then to the air. It didn't move like field fire. It moved like something that had learned the habits of a living thing and preferred them to its old ones. It rapped. It reached. It wanted to be more. The Ironborn sang louder, because rage was religion to them and the sound of dying was a chorus they took pride in conducting. But when Regal raked the second galley from stern to bow, the song went thin and then thinner and was gone. Viserion dropped fire like a net on the trailing ships. The river's mouth wore a crown that flickered and spat and swung in the wind. Euron's flagship did not turn. It drove at the cluster of Yara's ships as if it had not seen the dragons. From its high forecastle, men cranked at a machine whose arms flexed like a mantis. A bolt leapt. Drogon twitched without thinking, his body finding the space between one death and another the way a swallow finds the space between two branches. The bolt went past with a whirring sigh and struck a cliff face, where it trembled, absurdly upright, like a great needle in a stone mattress. The next bolt did not miss Regal so cleanly. Daenerys saw it take a sliver of wing, saw the dragons roll and the sudden kink in the air where his weight dragged on the wind. He screamed, but a scream of fury, not of pain. He banked and climbed and vanished into night so black it seemed to be a cloak thrown over his whole body. Viserion dove with him, protective as a brother who has seen his sibling bleed for the first time. "Bring me his eyes," Yara shouted from her deck, her voice the voice of a woman who has let fear strip everything from her but will. "The eye I want is in his head. Bring me that one." Theon did not shout. He moved with the blankness of a man in the winter of his mind. Yet he moved. He lifted a grappling hook and sent it spinning. It bit a rail and held. He was first over, and then men were behind him, boots finding purchase on a seam of wood or not finding it and falling and being trampled by water. The deck under his hands stank of pitch and old wine and the effort of men. Euron came out of the smoke like a joke told by a madman and put his axe into a boy Theon did not recognize. It went so easily that for a heartbeat Theon felt it as a courtesy, the axe showing the boy the shortest road home. Daenerys saw the sprawl and flail of it as a pattern, the way she had learned to see battle since she learned to be more than anyone's pawn. She drove Drogon low again, enough to bring wind and heat across the flagship's deck, enough to take men's breath. Euron laughed at the wind and threw his axe at the dragon's face, an action so needless and so certain to fail that it seemed like a charm to ward off sense. Drogon flicked his head as if at a fly. The axe spun high and fell, and Euron swayed his shoulders and spread his arms and did not stop laughing. "End him," Tyrion said on the quay, to no one and to everyone, while the scorpions wound and the bolts creaked and sheened. "End him and be done with half our trouble." "Not while he stands beneath Yara's men," Varys said. His voice came from far away, as if he had stepped already into the next hour and the one after. "Fire and kindness are poor bedfellows." Obara's spear licked over a shield and then, kink, twist, heave, found a joint that had not been there until she made it. Nymeria slid under a man's guard so close that for an instant they looked like lovers dancing. Then he folded and she stepped cleanly away and her knives were dry again. Tyene smiled at enemies the way a mother smiles at a child she has taught a lesson 100 times and will teach 100 more. The flagship shuddered. Yara was at the base of the great scorpion when it happened, her knife already red, her hair catching bits of firelight until it looked like an omen itself. The machine's arm came down half-cocked and caught a Greyjoy raider in the back. The man made a noise that sounded like a seagull being cut in half by wind. Theon found Euron in the press then, as if the sea had set it up to be inevitable, and their eyes met over their family's sins. Euron gave him his teeth. "Little flea," he said, delighted. "Did you grow your legs back?" Theon grew silence back. He moved his sword as if pushing aside reeds in a marsh, kept moving, took the first cut across Euron's ribs, shallow but honest. Euron's axe came in low. Theon's body remembered too much and for a moment tried to leave him, to fly away from him like a wisp of ash on heat. He shut his hand, hard, on the hilt until he felt new pain to replace old, and stood. He brought the pommel up under Euron's jaw, felt the click of teeth. It was only a second. It was enough to prove to himself that the second existed. Daenerys marked the moment like a sailor marks a star. She breathed once and loosened her grip on rage. "Drive him off," she told Drogon. Fire roared not at the man and his deck but along the water's skin, bright rivers hurrying outward from the flagship's side, hemming it, blinding its helmsman. The Ironborn shouted and cursed and tasted fear for the first time that night. Yara's whistle cut the air. Her men pulled away as if she had thrown a hook into their hearts and hauled. Grapples were loosed, oars bit, sails opened like mouths surprised by joy. Euron backed water with an oarsman's discipline as unnatural to him as prayer. He had the sense to live. When it ended, the night hung with the smell of burned pitch and the sweet stink of cooked kelp. A third of Euron's ships were scattered char, planks floating like gravestones. He drew the rest out to sea, hands blood-raw on oars, his voice whipped away by the wind as he made promises to the dark. Yara dragged herself over a rail and lay a moment on the planks, her cheek against them like a lover's, then pushed herself to her feet and began to count the living. Theon sat and shuddered like a man taking in air through a new hole. The sand snakes set about binding wounds. Not one of them had died. Illyria stood at Daenerys' shoulder, her eyes on the retreat. "You could have ended him," she said. "I did," Daenerys said quietly, because she had learned in Meereen that endings came in more kinds than one. "I ended the sea he owns. He will come again, but not as he came tonight. Vengeance delayed is a thorn put away for winter," Illyria said. "Then we will gather the thorns," Daenerys said, "and wreath a crown with them for the right head." In the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister listened to the tide batter itself against cliffs and refused to hear it as anything but applause. Fires burned in the city the way they always burned. From kitchens, from braziers that warmed hands and illusions, from little tallow candles put to bed one by one. News came like insects, separately, too small to notice at first, then suddenly everywhere. Euron Greyjoy had been forced off Dorne's coast. Yara's ships held the green blood. Smoke had been seen at sea. Euron's gifts would not be laid at her feet. She drank her wine and let none of that prick her. "We will take High Garden," she said to Jaime. "Take it out from under the old spider. Let Olenna count her gold when she is in her grave, if she likes." "Olenna is not a spider," Jaime said. He stood at the window because he was the sort of man who believes he will leave by the window if the door will not do. "She is the web. She is only one strand of it, and still she catches more than she can eat. We will not take High Garden. We will frighten the bees from the hive and walk away with their honey before they remember they can sting. We move fast. We leave a shell of men here to make it look as if we have hollowed ourselves. Tyrion will send the Unsullied at Casterly Rock. We should let him empty the rock, take the grain, break the reach. When the dragons come to save their bread, we show them our scorpions." "Show them to the dragons," Cersei said. "Or show them to the people, so the people can tell the dragons how brave we are?" "To the dragons," Jaime said, and felt the weight of it in his tongue, a coin badly minted. "And to whatever woman rides the biggest of them." "You loved me because I was beautiful," Cersei said blandly, and Jaime looked at her hand on the cup and thought of when that hand had been younger and less sure. "You love me now because I am the only thing left in the world that reminds you what you used to want. Ride to the reach. Bring me the grain. Euron will gnaw his wounds and pretend he is a lion. Qyburn." The maester stepped out from whatever shadow he had taught to carry him. "Your Grace, I want a yard of scorpions built for every yard of city wall," Cersei said. "I want them on the Tower of the Hand and on the September's Bones and in every alley where a woman could look up and think that a dragon is only a story. I want the city to grow thorns. When she comes, she will fly," Qyburn said, his voice moist with pleasure. "And we will see if flight is a trick or a truth." Daenerys did not sleep. When morning found her, she walked through the water gardens and let her fingers drag along the cool lips of the basins. The children came cautiously at first. A girl of 8 offered her an orange peel to a spiral. Daenerys took a section and bit and thought she had never tasted anything so undecided, sour and sweet, neither of them willing to give way. She asked the girl her name. "Aralda," the girl said. "My mother sells lemons by the gate." "Do you remember Elia?" Daenerys asked, not because she wanted to taste the past again, but because she wanted to know whether the past here was flavor or stone. "I remember her song," Aralda said simply, and shrugged like a bird shaking its shoulders dry. "My grandmother sings it when she is angry with the men." "Wise grandmother," Daenerys said. and gave the girl a ring she had never liked and had never gotten used to not liking. Aralda's eyes went round. "Tell her a new song is coming." By noon, riders streamed in with dust lying like an extra skin on their arms. The sun and spear flew. Men of House Fowler wore crests shaped like hawks' heads. Ironwood's boars snorted on brass. A lean lord with dunes carved into his face bowed for his house and for those who could not come. Ilaria moved among them like one of the small canals that keeps the whole garden alive, linking, murmuring, binding. Daenerys did not seat herself on the highest cushion. She stood while others sat. When she spoke of King's Landing, she spoke of food and, after food, of children. There were men with flint in them who would have cheered for fire. They found themselves, without knowing when it had been arranged, cheering for bread. The plan Tyrion drew made a net and a blade at once. The Unsullied would take Casterly Rock by a poster no one remembered except men who had praised the ingenuity of sewers. While Jaime swung west for the grain and honey wine, Daenerys would swing east along the Dornish marches and north into the Reach, skirting the deserts where only lizards and songs live, then burst onto the Gold Road where the wagons ran fat and clumsy with bread. She would show herself there, not in King's Landing, and offer in front of every man the choice that had been denied Elia. Bend the knee or be given to honest fire. "Think about the stories they will tell," Tyrion said quietly, when they stood over the map alone. "The songs decide what history tastes like to those who have to eat it. If they sing that you came to feed them, your enemies will have to use another flavor for their hate. If they sing that I burned their fathers, their hate will not need salt," Daenerys said. "Sometimes you burn because you are good," Tyrion said. "It's a hard thing to sing, but it's true." They rode at dusk. The Dothraki flowed over the plain like night coming early, harebells chiming, scimitars carried casually as water carriers balanced their jars. The Dornish spears pricked the horizon with red. Daenerys flew, a long murmurous flight that left the dunes silver under her shadow. From above, Dorne softened. Its hard lines took on a tenderness of curve and fold. She could have loved it. She did love it, she realized with a surprise that felt like the pain of biting her cheek. She loved it because it had refused her family. A land that has refused you and that you can win only by deserving it is a land worth wanting. They came on the Gold Road at noon 2 days later and saw carts lined up like a river that had failed to be water. The wagons creaked with sacks of grain, barrels of oil, bundles of flax. There were cattle to low like great organs sounding a single deeper note beneath the chatter of men. The Lannister column was ordered with a hand that expected to be obeyed. A familiar banner rode at its fore, gold on red, the lion stepping into the never. Beneath it were smaller standards, the Tarly huntsman, green on brown, the black anvil of House Pain. Daenerys took Drogon down to a height where she could see the men's faces when they looked up. Surprise had a way of making men iguales. They all wore the same expression at first, whether lord or levy. Shock peeled away into everything else. Courage, fear, stubbornness, the first step of cowardice that looks like cunning. She saw Randall Tarly at the head of his men, hard as a hammer, his son beside him with youth written on his armor because he had not yet learned how to hide it. Daenerys landed in the wheat, and the wheat lay down like a carpet that had decided to serve a queen. Drogon folded his wings. The sound was like the shutting of 100 doors. She walked forward until she stood between Tyrion and the Tarlys, and she spoke to the road. "I am Daenerys of the House Targaryen," she said, and heard without meaning to the echoes of all the names others had given her and all the names she had given herself. They all stood behind her like earlier footsteps showing you where to put your feet now. "I came to Westeros to break a wheel that crushes you and your sons and your daughters in turn. Cersei Lannister sits in King's Landing and would starve you all to feed herself through winter. I will not starve the children of this realm. Bend the knee and live as men who feed others. Refuse, and face the justice you have all been denied by those who wear crowns and armor and pretend that hunger is honorable." A murmur went through the ranks like a breeze that doesn't know yet whether it wants to be a wind. Some men knelt because bending their backs had always been easier for them than breaking their heads. Some men knelt because they were tired and the air near the ground was cooler. Randall Tarly did not kneel. He looked at her like a man measuring a plank, and when he had measured it, he threw it away. "I already have a queen," he said. "She sits a throne made of swords taken from men who had the courage to die with them in their hands. And you hold wagons full of grain for her while the rest of the realm wonders whether there will be seed enough for spring," Daenerys said. Randall's face did not change. He wore his honor the way other men wear scars. "You are foreign," he said. "You bring sellswords and savages and creatures that do not belong to the world. You burn the men who will not kneel and call it justice. You ask for love, but you show only fear. I will not bend." Dickon Tarly looked from his father to the dragon and back. There was sweat ring under his arms, darkening the green. He swallowed. "Father," he said. "This is the work of men," Randall said. And the work of men settled on them as if the sun had pushed down all at once. Tyrion stepped forward and spoke to Daenerys quietly. His voice never meant for more than her and the weak. "Take the knee of those who would keep their heads," he said. "Send the rest to the wall. Put Randall and his son in chains. Let them live to be grateful and to tell others that you had mercy when you could have chosen convenience." Daenerys could feel the 100 eyes of the road on her, as if each were a small weight placed carefully along her spine. The road held its breath. She thought of the water gardens and the children who would always want oranges. She thought of Euron's laugh and of the bolt going through Rhaegal's wing as easily as a thought. "Randall Tarly," she said, and the sound of the name in her mouth felt like lifting something that had been left in the sun and was too hot to hold. "You chose your queen. Dickon Tarly, you may choose another." Dickon looked at the wheat. He looked at his father. He looked at the dragon. "It is not for a son to be a better man than his father in front of him," he said simply. Daenerys nodded. There was no anger in it. There was a sadness that did not show on her face. "Then you will go as you have lived together." When Drogon's fire came, it came hot enough to erase doubt. Men flinched and then stood because there was nothing else to do. The smoke leapt and fell and leapt again. When the ash settled, there were 2 tall shadows that were not there and then were not there again. The air smelled like iron and bread. Nobody spoke. That night in camp, the Dothraki sang low to their horses. The Dornish drank wine that tasted like they had crushed stars to make it. The Unsullied were already ghosts, moving on Casterly Rock in the darkness by a path that had made men laugh when Tyrion first traced it with his finger. Daenerys sat at the edge of the firelight with Missandei and Grey Worm. Beyond them, the wheat ran to the horizon like a thought she could not finish. "You gave them a choice," Missandei said gently. "You cannot make the choice for them too." "I could not make the choice and call it rule," Daenerys said. "But I could taste how much easier it would be. One word and the road becomes a grave and the grain cooks in the fire and no one has to decide anything ever again. I could live like that and call it justice. I think there are kings and queens who have done that and slept well." "If you sleep poorly," Grey Worm said, "you are a better queen than they were a king. This is a good pain." "Pain that does not help is not good," Daenerys said. She watched the sparks lift from the fire and vanish. "Tomorrow the songs will begin. I do not know what they will say." "They will say you are not Cersei," Tyrion said from the shadow behind them. He came forward, holding a cup as if it were a book he intended to read later. "Which for the moment is the halo that lights you whether or not you deserve it. And you do." A raven found them before dawn. It came from the north, flown long, the string tied about its leg frayed and stiff with frost, though the morning in the reach was soft as a neck. The hand that took the letter shook before it reached Daenerys. Missandei cut the knot and handed it up, and Daenerys read the having of winter aloud. The dead had been seen at Eastwatch. They came down the coast in a line like a wound, the snow around them clean and blank as an unwritten page that had decided never to be written. Bran Stark saw them with a kind of sight that no one wanted and everyone needed. Jon Snow sent the words. He called her Your Grace and then wrote Daenerys, as if there were no contradiction in that, as if 2 names could sit side by side and not fight. "What is that Dragonstone?" Daenerys asked, after a long quiet in which the camp woke and began to be itself again. "Dragonglass," Tyrion said. enough to make a forest of spears, enough to arm those who believe and to convince those who do not. Then he will come here, Daenerys said. She could see it. The map in her head turned and turned until it stopped with the narrow strip of water at the bottom like a footnote. Or we will meet him elsewhere. Dorne is not a place that welcomes the cold, but it welcomes those who bring a pledge. He will come with his hands open. He will not bring lies. He does not seem made to wrap words around themselves that way. You speak as if you've met him, Missandei, I said. I have met men like him, Daenerys said, and I have met men nothing like him. I do not know which is worse. In the days that followed, the news came in clumps that defied tidy arrangement. The Unsullied took Casterly Rock and found less there than the pride they had come to take. The coin had gone to pay for wagons and swords. Olenna Tyrell received Jaime Lannister in a room heavy with bees and told him truths he had never let reach him. The Reach was a patient loaf cooling on a windowsill while hungry children and thieves and queens all walked by pretending they did not smell it. Euron dragged what was left of his fleet, licking its wounds into smaller coves, and practiced saying the word later to himself as if it were a weapon. Cersei wheeled and did not know whether she was a hawk or a vulture. The scorpions bred on the walls of kings, landing like spiders who had found the perfect crack. Jon Snow came south with Davos Seaworth and an understanding of leadership that had more to do with carrying than being carried. He went first to Dragonstone and found stone and wind and a garrison of men who spoke quietly and were kind and told him where the queen was. He looked out at Blackwater Bay and saw only the absence of a fleet and the presence of a promise and chose to keep going. The sea that had let Dany come like a prophecy let him come like a man who had no time for prophecies. When he set foot on Dorne, the heat hit him like a fact, and he stripped off his wolfskin and looked smaller and more dangerous without it. When Daenerys met him, the air trembled with something that was not quite heat. Drogon spiraled once and coasted to a rest on a tilted tower, the stone giving slightly under his weight and then discovering again how to be stone. Jon's eyes went to the dragon and then, stubbornly, away. He came forward and bowed less deeply than most and more truly than many. Your Grace, he said, I am here because I believe something that will ask you to believe something you don't want to. Most men come to ask me for the thing they want to believe, Daenerys said. She studied the particularities of him. The way his hair refused to do what hair in stories does. The way his mouth held back more than it gave. The way his hand hovered near a sword as if it were a friend who could also be a bad influence. Tell me, he told her. He told her about cold that did not care what crown you wore, about a king that was not a king and an army that was not an army and a war that would erase the idea of harvest from men's minds. He told her about dragonglass and gifts carved from night and words that uneasy men had taught their children as if the sounds could keep out the soundless. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at her as if she were a salvation. He looked at her as if she were work. She listened until she had listened enough. She thought, the world always sends you two problems at once, the loud one and the real one. She thought of Euron's gutted ships dark under a dawn like a bruise and of two piles of ash where men had been. She thought of a winter no one in Dorne had ever tasted and of the way some things are true regardless of weather or music. When she answered, she did not raise her voice either. I will give you dragonglass, she said. I will bring you fire. I will feed what you feed when men bend the knee to you, and I will not ask them to choose unless choice would kill them. In return, I will ask the North to remember that I did not come to salt the earth. You will not have to love me, but you will not call me foreign when I come to keep your children alive. Jon's mouth made a shape that might one day be a smile and might one day be a wound. I did not come to love or to hate, he said. I came because there is a night marching. If you stand against it, that's all the vow I need today. Good, Daenerys said, because I intend to stand against everything that marches and wants men to kneel to it without thinking. She looked toward the north as if sight could do what travel could not. The line of the dunes made low mountains of sand. Beyond them the world dropped and rose and dropped again until it reached something she could not see. We will plan. We will do the small things first and then the large. It is the only way to carry a city across a river, one stone at a time, held very carefully. At night, the water gardens learned a new music. It was quiet, a sound like someone thinking out loud. Missandei and Grey Worm walked beneath the lemon trees without touching each other and learned again how to talk about the day without letting it into their dreams. Tyrion sat with a cup he did not finish and a book he did not open and made lists in his head of the names of men who had died because he was historically accurate. Ilaria watched the sea and pressed her finger to the glass vial at her throat and discovered that not every poison needed to be swallowed to leave a taste. Daenerys lay not sleeping and listened to the wakefulness of her dragons. She knew their breaths now with a knowledge that lived in muscle, not thought. When Drogon exhaled, she could feel the heat at the small of her back, as if the air itself had laid a hand there. She did not know what kind of Queen Dorne would sing that she had been, whether soft or hard, foreign or familiar. She had done one thing exactly as she meant to do it. She had come here first. Sunspear's spear cast its long shadow over the tiles, and the shadow reached almost to the bed where she lay as if offering a wordless pact. Morning would demand 1,000 answers. Winter would demand more. Between them lay the small, deliberate act of breathing. She did that. The wind off the sea moved the oranges against the leaves with a sound like 1,000 soft coins. Somewhere in the city, a boy laughed as he fell into a pool and came up furious and delighted. In the high dark, where the scorpions on the Red Keep's walls had not yet become anything but plans, a raven shook its wings and began again to work its way south. Dawn broke like a decision that had been argued all night and finally agreed between weary friends. In the water gardens, the fountains began their small labors. A lemon fell with a soft thud into a basin and lay there, spinning. The servants carried bowls of olives and flatbread across tiles the color of cooled embers. In the shade of an orange grove where the air kept its own secrets, Daenerys met Jon Snow again, and the air between them had changed in some way that could not be timed. It might have been the letter. It might have been the heap of ash that memory kept rearranging into the shapes of two men. It might have been the knowledge that they were both being asked to do something larger than themselves that did not care whether they deserved it. Davos stood to one side, not quite leaning on his bad hand, eyeing the citrus with a sailor's suspicion of things that grow too easily. Tyrion had a slate and chalk and the alertness of a man accustomed to losing sleep in fair trades. Missandei wrote at her own neat pace, the sound of her quill like a small, calm animal breathing. Varys listened the way old trees listen to crows. "It will not be enough to mine the glass," Jon said. "We must move it. The seas are watched. Roads can be taken. The wall is far, and what stands behind it is nearer than men want to know. Eastwatch by the sea is the last place a man can stand and still say he is a man. I need the glass there, not in a promise, not at a warehouse there. The ships that braved the stepstones and the smoking sea to bring me here can brave what lies between Dragonstone and Eastwatch," Daenerys said. "But not if they sail as prizes for Euron Greyjoy to choose from." She touched the hilt of the little knife she had acquired not for its utility but for the comfort of the fact of it. "We will move by peace. Not a treasure fleet to make the sea lick its lips, but teeth, one by one, ferried inside mouths." Yara slowed her smile the way a thief slows his hand at the edge of a purse. "Divide and cheat," she said. "I can lie to water better than Euron can. He likes the sea to look at him when he does brave things. We'll give it nothing to look at. Dornish galleys will carry fish on the deck and knives below. We'll raft crates of glass into reed beds and pull them like eels up a river. Some will go to White Harbor in casks marked for pickled lemons. Some to Eastwatch on the back of mules who've swapped names twice. We will need forgers," Davos said. "Not to lie, mind you, but to print true words on false papers. A different trade, but it smells the same." "I know a boy in Flea Bottom," Tyrion said. "He can read a man by the way he spells his daughter's name. He'll glitter to be asked to spell dragonglass on the king's business and sleep in a lord's bed. Dangerous work for him, but then he has always liked the sort that leaves him bragging to his shadow." "Bring him," Daenerys said. "Bring him," Jon echoed, surprise passing quietly over his face that he had said it. "First," Daenerys said, I will see the caves and stones for myself. A queen who sends men to dig in the dark should know what the dark holds. Then we set the first crates afloat and begin the business of smuggling winter. She flew by morning, Drogon's wings through shade that moved like a living map across dunes and scrub, over the stitched quilt of little fields where the people of Dorne grew what could be grown and sang at what refused them. Regal came, spiraling easily. Viserion chased the wind as if the wind had stolen something from him. Jon stood on the deck of a fast galley from Planky Town and watched her go, then turned his eyes to where the sea breaks on Dragonstone like a habit. Davos watched him with the patience of a man who has seen storms outlast ships and ships outlast storms. "You've that face on," Davos said. "What face?" Jon asked, not moving his eyes. "The one says you've seen a door that needs opening and you're deciding whether to use your hand or your head. The head costs more, but it breaks fewer knuckles." "I don't have time for knuckles," Jon said, "or for doors." He drew a breath and let the salt slap the inside of his mouth. "But I have to go through them anyway." Dragonstone rose, black and elaborate, as if a god with too much time had sat on the shore, whittling. The caves yawned beneath, mouths full of ancient promises. When Daenerys stepped into the largest, her breath fogged, not with cold but with the memory of it. The air tasted mineral and clean, unvisited. The light from the torches picked out seams in the stone that shimmered like the bellies of fish. She ran her hand along a wall and felt it rough and slightly oily, like the skin of some old beast that had learned to live beneath the earth. Jon came later to stand beside her. They did not speak for a time, partly because words in that place sounded like a trespass. The drawings lay ahead of them the way a man lies down when he has carried too much and means still to protect what he carried. Children with eyes like berries. Men whose faces had been given more geometry than expression so that they could stand for more than themselves. Spirals that made the torchlight dizzy. There were figures with pointed faces and hair like blades of ice. There were men and children together, fighting something drawn as nothing more than the outline of a cold wind, in strokes so simple they were indecent. The simplicity mocked them. "Truth that doesn't care how well you tell it," Jon said. "It always looks like a child's story," Daenerys said, "and it always turns the room to listen." "What room?" he asked. "All the rooms that will have to hold the dead if we don't keep them out." She set her torch in a bracket that had been cut into the rock by hands long gone. "I will send words north with the glass. I will also send men. I will ask for none of yours to bend their heads to me while they work. This isn't a question of kneeling. There are questions that are and questions that never were. And there is this." The mine woke. Picks bit. Wedges were driven. The stone gave with a sigh like the easing of a stiff joint. Forgers found hollows. Barges were built in a day by men who had built barges every day of their lives. Davos took the ledgers in hand and discovered that he liked the way the numbers looked when they told the truth and still managed to fool anyone listening. Tyrion sent Varys' whiskered little birds into the alleys of kings, landing to whisper that a shipment of spices would be rowing upriver at night, and waited to see who came to greet it. Missandei organized the words. She put seals on letters, set couriers' feet in motion. She answered questions from smiths and captains and children in a small, even tone that made men feel the world could be made into a thing that ran on sense. Jorah Mormont came quietly, as if the sea had been waiting for him and had taken its time to give him up again. He wore a new shirt to hide old shame and an older smile he had not used in years. He walked up through Dragonstone's courtyard and saw her at the well and fell to his knee before his knee thought to bend. "My queen," he said. Her name for him lived in her before she spoke it. "Jorah." He watched her face the way starving men watch the flanks of a healthy horse and make themselves turn away. "I am cured," he said, showing the bare skin of his forearm like a bribe. It looked like a map rubbed out. "A man at the Citadel, Samwell Tarly, cut it from me with a knife and a kind word. I owe him my life and more." "Tarly?" Tyrion said from the steps, more to himself than to anyone else. "There's a grizzled gardener fate chose not to bury beneath his father's branches." "Samwell," Davos said, and his voice warmed with a small, remembered gratitude. "Stannis kept him. Jon made him a brother. He reads the way other men fight. If he tells you the sky is a book, get ready to turn pages. Daenerys stepped forward and put her hand on Yora's healed skin. He did not flinch. He did not look at her hand. "Welcome home," she said. "I will never leave it again," he said, which was not a promise to stay but a vow to follow. News fluttered in, sometimes on ravens' legs, sometimes on the breath of men who had run too far too fast. The Unsullied held Casterly Rock but found themselves sitting on a throne of empty furniture. Jaime had left them stone and pride and taken the rest. Olenna was dead, and she had told her truth to the man who had come to deliver the lie that would ease her into it. The gold had reached the city in enough quantity to sharpen the Iron Bank's appetite. The grain had not, and Cersei began to discover what power tastes like when it is mixed with hunger. She met with Tycho Nestoris in a garden that had not yet recovered from being scorched by green fire. He smiled a smile that was all teeth and civility. "The bank is satisfied," he said, "for today. Tomorrow is a separate institution, but we own that one too. You will have your wars repaid," Cersei said and watched his eyes. "Perhaps not in full coin, but my enemies have more than money. I will pour their advantages into your coffers and let you count them. You will pour their lives," Tycho said, putting no taste on the words. "The bank collects those too in its way." When he was gone, Cersei let the silence climb the walls like ivy and settle. Qyburn came and showed her new bows with arms of black yew, new bolts with tips that drank flame and did not share it. He had had smiths and sad-eyed carpenters mount scorpions on wheeled frames that could be pushed along alleys and hidden behind carts of onions. He had had a dozen boys in the Street of Silk shown how to loose bolts at pigeons and had them practice until the birds learned to fear a certain rhythm of footsteps. "Make the city a forest of these," Cersei said. "When the dragons come, they will find trees that bite." Bronn slipped through the lower gates the way a weasel slips into a henhouse, remarking on how generous hens are to share their lives and then remarking on it again through a grin. He whistled a tune that no one knows themselves humming. He sold a bale of moldy wool without unloading it. He met Tyrion outside a tavern where the beer tasted like boiled bread and lies were cheap. "Your face looks terrible on a wanted poster," Bronn said. "It makes your nose look honest." "My nose has always been honest," Tyrion said. "It tells me when the air stinks. How is our brother?" "Gallant as ever," Bronn said. "He'll meet you, not because he wants to hear you but because he wants to remember whether he knows your voice. Don't bring a dragon. He's touchy about them." They met in the shadow of a half-collapsed granary where rats had set up a government more stable than most. Jaime stood with his good hand flexing and his bad arm quiet, shining like a question. The sight of Tyrion put a slant on his mouth. "You always bring the past with you," Jaime said. "It arrives before you and sits down in my chair." "The past is cheap and travels light," Tyrion said. "The future is pricey and demands trunks." He looked at his brother the way a locksmith looks at a door and calculates not only how to open it but what it will cost the hinges. "Cersei will lose if she insists on winning alone. The dead do not distinguish between crowns. Ask her to talk. In the open, under the eyes of half the realm. Send her to the dragon pit. We'll bring a thing she cannot refuse to believe." "You want me to trust you," Jaime said and laughed. "You want me to trust that you'll bring a traveling corpse. It sounds like one of Bronn's jokes, only less expensive. I want you to trust that the alternative to believing me is worse for your soldiers than believing me can possibly be for your pride," Tyrion said. "Which has always been the way to persuade you when you strip away the poetry." Bronn chewed on a nail and spat half of it out. "If a dead man walks into the dragon pit and doesn't ask for a ticket, I'll buy the first round for all the watchmen in the city. It'll be the first honest drink they've had since they learned to be sober." Jaime's face loosened, just slightly, at the corners. "If you bring me your story in a box that opens," he said, "I will get you a room where you can tell it without being shot by my sister's new toys. I can promise you nothing else. But I will do this much for the city we were both born in." "Do it for the living," Tyrion said. The city is only where they gather to be left alone together. Gendry came out of the forge the way a song comes out of a throat, surprised to find there was a listener. He had arms like honest furniture and a brow that could have been put to use as an anvil in a pinch. Davos found him in a stinking alley where fish learned to die politely and said his name, and the boy looked at him like a dog looks at the first voice that has ever called it a name it wants to hear. "I'm tired of hiding," Gendry said. "Hiding is work and you don't get paid." "Then come do work that pays in a different coin," Davos said. "We need a man who can make glass into things that keep you on the right side of breathing. I hear you're the kind of honest who doesn't brag about it." "I don't brag because I'm not very interesting," Gendry said, and blushed at how true it sounded. He put a hammer in a sack and a little shaped piece of iron he had been whistling at for weeks. He was ready to leave his life in less time than it takes to put out a lamp. When the guards at the gate asked him his name, he said Clovis, and the lie fit him as if Davos had taken it in at the seams. At Dragonstone, the forge breathed and sweated. Gendry fell in love with the idea that stone could be dulled and filed and polished until it wanted to be a spear. He held a shard of dragonglass to the light and liked the way it gathered shadows. He liked that it ate flame and gave back nothing. "It's honest," he told Davos. "It is what it is. If it's going to cut you, it cuts you. If it's going to break, it breaks at once. Then maybe it will teach us something," Davos said. He liked the boy, not because of any old tales about bastards and kings, but because the boy's mouth made a square when he concentrated, and there was something trustworthy about squares. Missandei stood and watched the sea change colors the way a careful hand changes threads on a loom. Grey Worm came to stand beside her with the stiffness of a man who does not trust his own body to be near the thing it wants. "You have sand on your feet," he said. Not because he wanted to talk about sand, but because it was a thing he knew how to begin with. "It clings," she said. "Yes," he said. "So do some things in the mind. I try to wash them. They become cleaner, but they do not go." She smiled at him, the small, private smile of someone who understands grammar and forgives it anyway. "Cleaning makes them shine. That is not nothing." He watched the tide. "When the dead come," he said, "the sand will be hard in the morning, like stone. We will stand on it and think we are safe. We must remember it is sand. It only holds us up because it agrees to. Then we must learn to make it agree," she said. "We must speak to it in the language it understands, which is the same one the people understand. Food, warmth, safety, justice that works even when the dark presses down. We have to show them that the word queen does not mean the same thing here as it did when a man in red armor stood on their doorstep and said it." He nodded. It comforted him to imagine a world assembled of rules he could learn and then live by. It was what had saved him once. It might save him again. Illyria Sand walked the low walls of Sunspear at night and let the sea's voice climb her bones. She had not expected to live in a world where her grief was not food for something else's feast. She had set the vial aside and worn a simple strip of leather at her throat for a week. Then she put the vial back on because memory is not well behaved when you order it around. She watched the lanterns of Yara's patrol boats slide like cautious fish along the coast and said the name Elia only once. It was enough. Nymeria and Obara took a dozen picked women and men up the old mountain road not to assault King's Landing itself. That would have been a foolishness that tastes sweet at the start, but to slice at the wrists of the empire that fed it. They cut a convoy of wine from the arbor and let the wine go to the ditches while leaving the mules with windows for their eyes tied to a post with cress growing around it. They played water on little fires cleverly so the smoke would be thin and hard to see. When a knight in crimson came to tell them they had no right, Nymeria cut the laces of his saddle and let him speak to the dirt about rights. Tyene washed his mouth out with vinegar so he would live, and then left him with bread. "Mercy?" Obara asked. "An argument," Tyene said, shrugging. "We can't win all of them with knives." A raven from Winterfell came to Dragonstone with a letter that had Sansa Stark's clear hand and a coldness that was not unkind. She wrote of men who remember how they bled last time and would prefer not to do it again under banners that feel southern to their throats. She wrote of Bran, who saw without seeing, and of Arya, who had come home like a knife someone had thought they had lost. She wrote that Littlefinger had learned to dress his fear in softer cloths but had not removed it. She wrote to Daenerys that she would remind the North that they had knelt to kings and bled for them and received colder winters for their loyalty. Heavier words, she said, would require seeing eyes. Daenerys sent back a basket of letters with hard wax wearing her seal and a ribbon for each house, broken into the blues and greens and browns of their fields. She wrote that hunger did not consult the color of a man's cloak. She wrote that she had stood in the wheat and chosen not to burn it, even when burning would have felt like the simplest answer to a complicated question. She wrote that she asks for respect first because love is a gift that can be taken back, but respect is a trade you can keep making as long as both sides honor the weights. She wrote that she would not make the North kneel to the South in exchange for bread, because bread tasted of depends. She would ask them to stand beside the South and eat. Jon read her words and felt how carefully they had been cut and polished. He took a sheet of rough paper and wrote a reply that looked ugly next to hers and tasted better in his mouth. We will stand with those who stand. We will fight with those who fight. I don't know how to write what a man needs when the dead are near, but I know it isn't a crown. It's a fire at his back and a wall in front of him. Bring one. We have the other. It was Davos who said the part that men would later pretend had been decided by history. If you want Cersei to sit at a table she isn't using as a cutting board, he told the council. You have to bring her something she can't use a lie to kill, a dead thing that won't die to suit her. A bit of the problem for people who haven't seen it with their own dying. I will not send Jon Snow north again until boats loaded with dragonglass follow him like a school of fish, Daenerys said. Then send me, Jorah said. If there must be a small party, send me with it. I have run north enough times. Let me do it once for a reason that isn't my shames. I will go, Jon said, as if there had not been a moment between the saying and the thought. If I ask men to walk into cold for me, I will put my feet in the same snow. There are names in the north that won't answer anyone else. There is a trust that doesn't travel well. You all speak as if we are buying winter at market, Tyrion said. Jon will go and Jorah will go, and we will send a second voice in case the first freezes. There ought to be a third who can talk to men who prefer hurting themselves to being helped by others. The Hound, Davos said, and smiled with that particular fondness he reserved for men who had seen worse and still swore at the cup when it spilled. He's with the Brotherhood. He has a face that tells the truth even when the words don't. He believes in fire the way a man believes in a bridge, skeptically and with gratitude when it holds. If he says the dead are coming, men will listen. If he spits while saying it, they'll still listen. Ravens stitched letters across miles. Beric Dondarrion read words meant for him by a man he had not met and nodded to a god he could not trust. The Brotherhood turned north, a long thread on a white cloth. Tormund Giantsbane stood on the seawall at Eastwatch and laughed at the cold because it had always been his wife. He laughed less when he saw what moved like a line of mildew on the horizon and never stopped moving. He sent his own ravens and then built more fires than sense requires. Before Jon sailed, he stood in the Dragonstone courtyard with Daenerys, and the wind brought them the talk of gulls, which is nothing if you don't speak it and too much if you do. He looked at Drogon with a look he seemed to have borrowed from someone who had loved something too young and lost it. He reached his hand up, slowly, the way men reach for horses when they do not want to be bitten. Drogon looked at him with one long black pupil, and then lowered his head and let the hand rest against his snout, as if it were a generous idea he had decided to entertain. Daenerys watched the lean of her dragon's head and had to teach her face how to be still. He likes you, she said, and the words belonged to another world where women laughed in meadows. She was south of that world and north of the one where she had sold herself for an army, and she understood the precise difference. Animals can smell the dead on a man, Jon said, or the not dead. I don't know what I am on a scale that matters to dragons. You are stubborn, she said. They recognize their own. He went. Jorah went. Davos went as far as Eastwatch and promised Jon he would bring a boat's worth of miracles to the foot of the wall once a fortnight until the sea froze or he did. Gendry came too, because the boy had learned in 3 days that hammers were no use against an army in the cold unless the hammer was a man who refused to stop. In the north, the air drew knives. The light came late and left early, the way a man leaves a room where he suspects he is not welcome. Jon's party walked into a white world that refused to be more than 2 colors. Crows flapped along at a distance, indignant with hunger. Once, on the second day, they saw a grove of trees whose branches had glazed and were chiming faintly. "Pretty?" the hound said, and then, grumbling, "Pretty's dangerous." Beric's sword had learned a new art. When he drew, it liked to catch and then suddenly to let go and become fire. He and Jon spoke little, because faithful men recognize prayers in one another and do not want to trespass. Yora fell into step with Gendry and asked questions about steel no lord's son had ever asked a smith, and the boy answered with a specificity that could have built a ship. They found the first dead thing at a place where the snow drifted and made shapes like sleeping whales. It had been a woman once. It turned its head at them with a curiosity so innocent that Gendry nearly spoke an apology. Then it opened its mouth on a sound like a stone dragged across slate. The hound took its head off. It lay there looking at him as if he were a man it had met in another life, and then it stopped looking. "Fire," Beric said, "and they burned the rest because there were things the dead do not belong to." They went on. The second day they saw the line of white again, this time nearer. The air had a texture now, as if someone were combing your hair the wrong way. They crossed a frozen stream that made noises like glass being argued with. Gendry stumbled, cursing, and Jon grabbed him and took the weight without comment, and they walked on together without making a ceremony of it. They caught a small party, a handful of whites running ahead of the rest like the spilled beads of a broken necklace. There was one of the others with them, pale as new metal, his eyes a color that made living men's stomachs fold. Jon went at him without waiting for sense to make a speech, and Longclaw took him at the shoulder and went through like relief. The whites stuttered and fell as if someone had plucked their strings. One did not, clawed and twisted. The hound got a rope around it and they dragged it, writhing, and the sound it made went into the men's blood and made little barnacles there. "Box!" the hound grunted. They had brought one because they had in fact planned this thing, and they got the white into it and shut it, and the thing hammered and hissed and made Jon's teeth ache. The army found them at the lake. No one ever knows why a piece of water decides on a particular day to be treacherous. The ice held, and then it didn't. Jon realized in the same instant that they were surrounded and that the surface had begun to break. The shore was a necklace of figures, white on white, ranks of them, standing like bad ideas that had found bodies. A blue wind blew. They fell back to a rock in the middle. The water kept its own counsel. Jon counted men and found he had fewer than he wanted and more than he knew what to do with. "Ravens," he said, and Gendry knew without being told that he was the fastest. He stripped his pack and ran, and the sound of his breath seemed louder than the dead. He reached Eastwatch with his tongue dry and his heart arguing with his ribs. Davos caught him with 2 hands and put him in a chair and poured something that tasted like it remembered warmth down his throat. The raven went. It flew south with the air cold around its legs and reached Dragonstone in a night that was not a night at all but a long gray. Daenerys did not have to be told how to move when a voice that had not learned to shout properly said it was time to. She had always been the kind of woman the world did not give plausible rest to. She made for the cliffs with the knowledge of a place where the sea and the stone have argued for 1,000 years and neither has won. Tyrion spoke to her once, into the wind. "Do not go," he said, "not because I don't love the men in your care, because if you die, the world gets smaller in a way that can't be undone." "If I die," she said, with that awful clarity she sometimes held like a blade, "then a different world will be raised by other hands. But I am alive and they went north at my back. I do not plan to have them die there to protect my caution." She went with all 3. Drogon answered her need like an old song you can't forget even if you try. Viserion and Rhaegal rose because brothers do that when one of them hears danger in the throat of the other. The sky was thin with cold and then thick with it. She saw the white line of the lake, the dots that were men on the rock. She saw the dead around them like the margin of a page drawn wrong. Fire broke Winter's teeth. It always does, even when winter grows more teeth. Drogon wrote a red script across the white that any eye could read. Viserion and Regal bit lanes for men to run. The rock felt men's feet leaving it and discovered it could breathe again. Jon got his hand on Yora's shoulder and shoved him toward Drogon's side. The hound ran with the box, cursing, and Beric swung his sword once and then again and felt the light move up his arm like something that had remembered him at last. They were almost clear when the air changed shape. It happens when a storm decides to stop pretending to be a storm and begins to be a voice. It collapsed above them, and something out of it threw a spear that made a sound like sense breaking. Regal ducked with an animal's selfish instinct to live. The spear went past him. It struck Viserion instead, in the chest. He reared as if in joy and then came down with a sound that had never been heard on Earth and will never be again. He hit the lake the way a tower hits, and the water jumped and realized it was not enough to catch him. He flailed once, twice, like a thing trying to learn a gesture it was not built for, and then he stilled. Steam rose. The dead stood very still too, as if they too could be shocked. Daenerys made a noise that had nothing to do with language. Drogon twisted in the air as if he would tear the cold's head off. She brought him down hard beside the rock. Men leapt at his shoulders, hands scrabbling for ridges and straps. Jon turned to cover the retreat because his body had been trained to and because part of him had always held the ridiculous belief that he could fight the tide. He cut and cut. The cold made crystal splinters in his lungs. "Go," he said, and did not look back, which is the only way a man can believe that the people behind him are leaving and will be fine. The second spear came. Drogon bucked and screamed, and Daenerys threw her weight into him and took the pain of it through her legs into her spine and did not fall. The spear glanced. Regal tore the air with his claws and was there, snapping at a point on the horizon that wore a crown of frost. The figure there did not move quickly. It did not have to. It had already learned that the world behaves for certain kinds of patience. It lifted its hand again, slowly, gathering more cold than the sky had on offer. Jon felt the water give under his boots and knew that if he stayed one more heartbeat, he would belong to it. He turned and flung himself at the saddle, hit leather, found a strap, set a hand on the smooth hot plate of Drogon's side, and held. Daenerys looked down and saw his face, and it looked like a thing carved in ice that had learned to think and then had been told to stop. She put her hand against the back of his head and pushed it down, and Drogon took them up and away. Behind them, Viserion's body settled. The steam thickened, and the smell that rose was like iron and a memory of fire that could not stand to be itself. The king in winter watched without what could be read as interest. He sent men to drag chains that should not have been there but were. They wound them around Viserion's neck and claw and hauled him out like a child retrieves a toy from a pond. The sky held its breath. Later, men would say they had heard the ice crack in the shape of a name. Later, men would not go out on lakes in twos. They did not stop before Eastwatch. They did not stop there long. Jon had taken a cut across his side that laid him open just enough to make breathing a choice. He shook with a cold that had nothing to do with air. Daenerys sat by his bed wrapped in furs that could not recall Essos no matter how she pressed her face into them. She looked at his skin where the arrow of death had not found him, and at the scars that had, and it was all she could do to keep from counting them out loud. When he woke, he fumbled for a name before he remembered his own. "I'm sorry," he said, because that is a thing he had learned to do since he was small. "For what you cannot keep," she said. "For what wants to be taken anyway." She did not know she had put her hand on his hair until she felt it there, a weight that could also be a message. "I will bend the knee," he said, and the words did not disgrace him. "Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because of the dragon that fell, though he did. Because I looked into a place where nothing ought to be, and I saw you in front of it with fire in your hands, and I understood that I will follow that or die trying to build it behind you." She looked at him, and in the looking felt a crack in some corner of herself that had been stone since she was a child telling her brother that she was not his to sell. It did not hurt. It felt like a bell that had not been rung in a long time striking once and discovering it had not forgotten how. "Then rise," she said, because he could not kneel. and the old phrases were sometimes useless in rooms like this. The ship that bore them south again moved as if it knew men were writing stories on its decks and would later give it a name. Davos ordered the wind and the cooks with equal authority. Gendry sat near the bow with a hammer across his knees and stared at the horizon in a way that suggested he was trying to add his own line to it. Jorah stood with his hands on the rail and taught his grief how to sit without spilling. Missandei watched Daenerys when she thought no one watched her. Grey Worm watched Missandei watching. Tyrion wrote letters he had already written in his head a dozen times, and each time found a phrase that lessened the lies and increased the chances that men would swallow them. In King's Landing, Qyburn rolled the first of the wheeled scorpions out in front of the royal smithies and made a small speech about leverage that made the apprentice's eyes go soft. Cersei stood on the balcony and could not stand to see the moon because the last time she had looked it had been full, and this time it had a bite taken out of it. Jaime came to her with a face that had learned a new sorrow, and perhaps because of that, perhaps in spite of it, he looked younger. He told her what he had seen in the eyes of men who had watched a dragon fly low enough to cut their helmets off with its belly. He told her that the gold had bought them time and the grain would not buy them love. He told her that Tyrion would be asking for a meeting at the dragon pit, and that he meant to entertain the request. "We do not kneel to parley," Cersei said. "We do not kneel," Jaime said. "We stand, and that is different." She nodded as if she had given him permission to say what he had already said. "Arrange it. Let the city see their monster in daylight. Let them see me stand against it. And if she brings a trick, we will show her that we have learned some of our own." The dragon pit had not seen a dragon in 100 years. It was a bone. It was history's mouth, and fewer people than you'd think wanted to stand in it and talk. The city thronged above, humming like a hive that has been told the bear is coming and has chosen to count its honey rather than flee. Bronn arranged the benches as if placing bets. The Kingsguard stood with hands that wanted to test their swords against unbelievable skin. The faith militant had been broken by wildfire. What remained of piety in the city watched from windows with candles, newer and smaller than the last time. Daenerys came on foot because she understood theaters. Drogon and Rhaegal nested on the broken wall where once their grandfathers had been stalled like horses whose riders were vain. Jon walked at her right and could not keep himself from watching the shadows for movement. Tyrion walked on her left and thought about how many times a man could ask the world to behave before it decided to teach him a lesson instead. Cersei, in white that looked like a thread of snow, sat already. Qyburn stood behind her, very nearly smiling. Jaime had placed himself where he could move without moving. Euron Greyjoy was there too, because men like him smell audiences the way boars smell acorns. He shouted at the dragons as if they were men on a wharf. The dragons ignored him the way storms ignore fishermen's curses. When the box was brought forth and opened, the dead thing came out of it as if a cork had been pulled and an old wine had been waiting to ruin itself. It ran at Cersei, and Cersei did not move, because the best lies are performed without flinching. The hound yanked it back by the chain, and Beric cut it in half and then set it aflame, and the two halves flopped like fish and then stopped. The smell climbed the pit. The crowd above made a noise that belonged in kitchens and bedrooms, the place where people keep their private syllables. Cersei sat very still. She looked at Jon Snow and saw a man who was not performing. She looked at Daenerys and saw a woman who might be. She looked at the fire eating through something that had been took from a man who still kept the habit of breathing, and she learned something she did not want to and could not unlearn. She said that there could be peace while the North fought the North's war. She said that she would not require the South to bend the knee. She said words that slid like warm oil on cold meat. Jon said no. He said he had already given his word. The word had been given to a queen whose name tasted of foreign lands. He had given it anyway. He would not take it back as if it were a coin you can pry free with a knife. Men looked at him as if he had spit in their soup. Tyrion tried not to bury his face in his hands. Daenerys looked at Jon and saw, with a jolt that was almost laughter, that he was exactly what he had told her he was, and the world would have to rearrange itself around that or crack. Tyrion went to talk to Cersei, because sometimes the only way a man can keep faith with himself is to go alone to the part of the house where the person who hates him lives and ask for a glass of wine. He went into the red room where she kept her anger in decanters. He said he had killed their father. She said she had carried 3 children for a man who had never been her husband and loved them enough to burn cities to keep them 1 heartbeat longer. He said he had nothing to give her but a chance to be remembered as something other than a tally of bodies. She said she had nothing to give him but a chance to leave with his own. When they came out again, Cersei stood in the pit and said that the war would pause for winter. She said the word pause as if it were poise. She said the word winter as if it were weapon. She lied, and the lie hung in the air like a banner someone has forgotten to take down after the festival. Jaime looked at her as if he had at last found the seam in the tapestry where the stitching could be pulled. Euron shouted that he would leave, that he preferred to worship more honest gods on quieter islands. Cersei did not look at him, and then later instructed Qyburn to send him to sea with secrets in his hold. They left the pit at dusk. The city breathed all at once, the way a woman in labor breathes when she hears that the head is out. Tyrion looked small under the great black ribs of the place where dragons had once lived like sins men did not have to confess. Jon walked with Daenerys and said nothing. She touched her hand to the stone as they passed and felt an old warmth in it that was only memory. The truce lasted as long as it needed to in order to create stories about itself. Cersei gathered her men in the Gold Cloaks barracks and told them that promises made to enemies are a kind of coin meant to be counterfeited. She sent Euron to bring a company of sellswords whose name had not often been written in the ledgers of Westeros. She told Jaime she intended to let the North bleed and then burn what had not bled easily. Jaime said that he had ridden through fields that had learned their lesson from Dragonfire and would not hold another. He said he was done serving a story that ends with everyone dead and his name on a list told to children as an insult. He took a horse and a cloak and rode north until snow took the sound of his going. In Dorne, the orange trees remained in. Different to all this, Daenerys returned there with Jon because it remained the only place in the south that had greeted her with something like honesty. The water gardens took the cold out of their bones and returned their skins to them. The Dornish lords came to listen without bowing. Illyria and her daughters gave Jon that special Dornish courtesy that is half forgiveness and half warning. The Unsullied rotated through the River Watch and did not tell stories about the ghosts of Casterly Rock, because they did not tell stories at all. But sometimes at night, a man would cough in his sleep in a way that made another man's hand go to where his spear would be. They set up tables under the arcades and set maps on them. The last of the harvest wagons from the Reach were escorted by men who looked sick with pride and relief. The North sent ravens that asked for more glass, more bread, more fire. The Wall sent no ravens, and then sent one that said the Eastwatch had fallen and that the dead walked through the gap as if it had been made for them. The light in the north went out of the sky, and a new light came that belonged to a living thing which had once been dead. It made a sound that undid something in anything living that heard it. Distant shepherds in the hills of the Red Mountains stopped, wondering why their goats had stiffened at once and then tried to climb the sky. "We cannot wait for spring," Tyrion said, at a council that had run beyond civil hours into the part of night where men are honest by mistake. "It will not come with the old rules." "It never does," Varys said. He had been sending whispers into alleyways so deep that even the cats did not admit to knowing them. "It is not a season. It is a test. The North will stand," Jon said. "Even when the ground is a drum and nothing sings from it, they will stand. But when they fall, they will want to fall facing south so someone sees them. I would have those eyes be yours, not Cersei's." "I have seen cities burn by accident and by plan," Daenerys said. "There is a way to bring light that does not leave the stones too hot to walk on when morning comes. I will learn it or break myself trying, but I will not be the woman who keeps fire in her hands because it makes her feel taller. I will be the one who gives it to men who are cold. After that, they can judge me by whether their children can still feel their fingers." "Your Grace," Missandei said softly. "The people in the alleys say what matters in a winter is not whose name is on the grain sacks, but whether the sacks split closing. If they do not split, they will come to your gates in spring and remember." "Let them come," Daenerys said. "We will be there to open the gates." She went among the Dornish more than a queen usually does. She stood where the fish carts came in at dawn and listened to a woman with a black tooth talk about the price of salt. She watched boys play at spears with sticks and saw in the smallest one a grace that did not belong to his age. She had the name of his mother taken down and the names of her brothers. She paid for a wheelwright's tools so he could teach the boy something kinder than war to use his wrists on. She walked with Ilaria in the gardens and asked about the Danes and the Ironwoods and the Fowlers, and let Ilaria answer in the ways that had kept Dorne from breaking when the rest of the realm snapped like old bone. She slept sometimes. When she did, the dragon that was not there came to her, not as a reproach but as a weight, like a book you mean to pick up and finish. She woke with salt on her lips from the sea and the small salts that come out of a human eye. She walked to where Drogon and Rhaegal slept with their heads tucked beneath their wings, and she lay down between them like an arrow laid at the nocks of two bows. The heat warmed her back and face differently, and she learned to love the specific ways she was warmed. In the north, the dead learned to walk through forests without breaking branches. They learned to follow the line of the smallest stream when the wind cut away their other senses. They learned to be patient with hills and cruel to houses. Men who had hunted for a living learned to be hunted and died, and then learned to hunt again. Sansa stood on the battlements of Winterfell and watched the snow come off the roofs in sheets and picked at the skin of her lips until they bled and then stopped and let them harden. Arya read the faces of the men coming in from outlying keeps and swapped some of her knives. Not because she needed different knives, but because men needed to believe she did something with them they would recognize. Brienne rode in with her cloak stiff and her hair like iron twine and stood still until she had stopped shaking. She stood before Sansa and said, "We will not hold forever." She had trained herself not to lie because she was bad at it, and she was fond of efficiency. Sansa said, "We will hold until we have to leave," which is what command is sometimes, dressing surrender in a better coat. Jaime Lannister reached the neck with a face so red with cold that men took him for a man who had always been Winter's son. He did not show his sword until asked, and when asked he showed it and did not smile. He spoke of armies that learn obeying so well that they forget how to disobey when the time comes. He said he wanted to stand on a wall that was not made of promises. Men listened because his voice held a thing that had learned humility without asking permission to. When he named himself, there was a moment's movement and no more, the way a larger animal's breath lifts the hair of a smaller one. He rode on and was not stopped. The dragons went north again. This time there were only two, and they drew lines in the air the color of copper when the sun hit them. Daenerys wore furs that made her look like a painting of a queen someone means to flatter and fails. Jon rode at her side. The Dothraki had left their bells quiet, because bells in cold sound like teeth chattering. The Dornish spears among them wore cloaks they called city-skins, which were not made for snow and made good stories for the grandchildren of men who wore them. At White Harbor they took in men, bread, firewood. Wyman Manderley had his cooks shape pies into little boats because he had always enjoyed the jokes food plays before it becomes more serious. He sang once, and the men cheered because the sound put fat on their ribs. He promised ships to take dragonglass farther up the coast than sense recommended, and then sent them and then sat down and slept for a day because there are things only large men understand about exhaustion. They reached Winterfell under a sky that had decided to stop being a sky and become a lid. The trees at the Godswood had clenched their hands around themselves. The heart tree looked as if it had been shocked into thinking again and found it was tired of the task. Daenerys stood at the edge of the pool and looked at the face carved there, and the face looked back with more patience than any human loves to meet. Sansa thanked Daenerys with the economy of a woman who has learned to count her gratitude carefully. Arya looked at Jon, then at the dragons, then at Daenerys, and owned her envy without letting it become a dog in the house. Bran sat and watched everything and said nothing until he said, "There is a dragon that belongs to the wrong song," and then stopped again and closed his eyes as if the voice that spoke had cost him something to borrow. There was a council. Men warmed their hands and pushed pins into maps and told the truth about the state of their boots. There were too few of everything. There always are. They discovered again the comfort of honest shortages. Jon spoke without ornament. Daenerys spoke with ornament that had learned not to dazzle. Tyrion spoke like a man asked to give a toast at the execution of someone he respects. The plan was not perfect. Perfect plans live only in rooms where nothing moves. The plan was to draw the dead to the field where they must come because living men dared them to, and to set fire where fire would do more good than harm, and to pull back in layers, and to remember that a line is only as good as the man who knows when to refuse to straighten it. She flew at dawn to test the sky. The cold caught in her throat and left scratches there. Drogon huffed steam. Snorting like a horse in a stable he intends to kick apart. Regal rolled in air like a coin someone keeps flipping until they like how it lands. From above, Winterfell was a design cut into white cloth. Men moved like the hands of a clock that has found urgency late in its life. She felt, for the first time since she had come into herself, small. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was humbling in the way of standing at the sea's edge and understanding you will never empty it with your hands. She found it made her more careful. At sunset, the first shadows appeared where no sun had passed. The dead arrived without hurry, the way men arrive for work. They stood and waited, and the waiting 8 hours and then what felt like years off men's lives. The front line kept looking back toward the braziers as if a warm man might have caught fire while their heads were turned. The sky went from gray to iron to something quiet and blue. The horns sounded. What followed cannot be written as a single line. It is not a song you can sing without ruining it. It is work done with hands that can no longer feel the tools. It is men shouting in voices that belong to boys in their first fight. It is horses learning to rear at nothing and hating themselves for it. It is arrows that burn and then don't. It is the way a man falls and rises again under a different order and then is stopped because another man has learned to use a spear like a sentence that ends correctly. It is the way dragons write light into air and the way air learns to read. Drogon took the left, Regal the right. Daenerys felt the recoil through her thighs each time Drogon loosed. She watched lines buckle and then hold and then buckle again. She watched the dead break and flow around living men like water around a rock, and she learned something ugly and useful about where to burn so that a man stands and another man falls and the space between them opens like a breath you can use. Jon moved where the line threatened to think about itself too much. Brienne kept her sword low and efficient and remembered every practice bout with every boy who had laughed at her and turned them into one clean cut at a time. Arya vanished and appeared and vanished, as if someone were writing her into and out of the scene with a white quill. At the center of all of it, there was a cold that made its own light. Daenerys felt it before she saw him. The king in the wrong season walked into the field like a man arriving late to a play whose ending he already has in his pocket. He drew up in a space where men forgot briefly what they were doing and then remembered at once and wished they hadn't. He lifted his hand. The dead moved as one, and the sound of it was a chord no living instrument makes. Daenerys brought Drogon to meet him. The fire hit the cold and the cold held, and the collision threw her forward in the saddle so hard she bit her tongue and tasted her own blood. He stood with frost clinging to him like a badge. He did not melt. He had already learned that tricks do not become true things by being done again. He looked at her and there was nothing there to look at except the desire to end. "Higher," she told Drogon. Not with words but with the language they had taught each other over dunes and cities and nights when men told themselves tales to be able to sleep. She took him up and then down at an angle that made her ribs ache with the pull. She hit the ground in a peal of flame that cut a gutter through the dead and let living men fall into it and find a moment where they could breathe and remember that breathing is useful. Regal came screaming across a line of pines that had not deserved any of this and tore a path toward the white figure. Arrows grew on Regal's side like ugly fruit. He banked left anyway and shook them, and the ones with iron heads fell but the others with something colder in them did not. Daenerys felt the note in Drogon's chest when Regal bellowed and saw in his shadow the smaller shape that should have been there and wasn't. Jon reached Bran in the Godswood while the tree wept something that might have been sap and might have been memory. The snow here was quiet, as if the dead did not like the place and preferred to let a single man decide what is sacred. The Night King came through the trees. Arya had learned the pond where the ice made a smoother mirror than any man. She came the long way, through places where no footprints keep their shape. Daenerys saw the choice before it showed itself. Dive and burn and try again to make the cold remember warmth, or trust that the small hot lives on the ground were doing what she had asked them to do and keep the sky. She kept the sky. She cut lines where retreat would someday be praised as cunning rather than called what it was: survival. She burned at the edges of men who could not risk a dragon's full kiss and watched the flames reach for her and understand then that they had a mistress and should follow orders. Arya moved like a word written in the right place. Jon held a man that had been his father's friend and helped him lie down for a rest he would not rise from. The Night King lifted his hand, and living men who had loved their wives put their hands on the snow to push themselves back up and found a different command instead. The tree looked very old and a little embarrassed by the urgency of youth. Bran opened his eyes. The wind went out. For a second it was the year men forgot how to speak. Then the wind came back and Arya left it a parting gift. He turned and she was not there. He turned again and she was. She left the thing she had brought. And all the learning of a winter 1,000 years long ended as quickly as a man's breath leaves him when a knife finds the place it was meant to live all along. There is a sound after a war ends that does not belong to any single war. It is relief and grief, and men learning how to stand properly again. It is the crack and slop of melting where things do not want to admit they have been changed and then have to. It is the grunting of men lifting what can be lifted and the soft, horrid squelch of pushing what cannot into a hole. It is prayers, some of them repeated so often the words have lost meaning and begun to grow it again. It is dragons huffing steam because the cold had been in their noses too and they did not like the taste of it. Daenerys landed in the Godswood with such gentleness that she would not have believed it possible when the day began. She slid down and her knees nearly gave way and she laughed and only then heard herself and realized what an odd, thin sound it was. Jon stood, his face a map someone had spilled water on. He looked at her and the look was not theatrical. It was the look of a man being handed a thing he had asked for and suddenly understanding how heavy it was. "It's done," he said. "Nothing is ever done," she said. "But this part is." Men told the story differently later. Some told it so that their part looked larger. Some told it so that the dead looked more like the kind of dead men are comfortable with. Some told it for coin and made sure there were places where children could laugh. Some told it once at dusk and then never again. In all their tellings, though, there was a place where a queen stood above a field cut into strips of light and dark and learned to love being small in the right room. The world did not reward them for this. It never does. It gave them next tasks instead, which is a kind of thanks men forget to recognize as such. The North would need bread and bodies buried and roofs repaired so that men would not wake to snow on their blankets. The South would need to be kept from thinking itself excused. The truce that had not been won would need to be turned into either something honest or a battleground so obvious that the choice became simple. They went south slowly, with the living, because to leave too fast would be to insult the ground. The dragons flew ahead and found what they needed and came back. In every holdfast men saluted with the awkwardness of people who had not known how to salute this woman yesterday and were learning how to do it in a way that did not hurt their dignity. Sansa watched them go with a look that had learned to keep its thoughts from showing. She said, when they had left, "Tell them to bring back spring," and meant it and hated herself a little for meaning it. Cersei welcomed Euron home with the kind of embrace that makes men in rooms like to look at their feet. He brought her Sellswords in neat rows, their captains fat with certainty. He brought her tidings of storms that had not killed him and ships that he had made kneel. He brought her the assumption that the world loves men who did not die by that much. Qyburn pried open crates and smiled the way a small boy smiles when a beetle does exactly what he thought it would do. Jaime was not there to call any of them to the part of their mind that knows better. Daenerys gave Dorne something it had not asked for and quietly found it had wanted. Time to teach its children to speak of justice without using the word later as a promise or a threat. She had houses raised for men too cold to learn to love again quickly. She sat in judgment on a man who had stolen bread from a caravan and someone else's bootlace to bind his child's hand with. She sent him to work with the brickmakers and not to the gallows. Illyria watched and learned a new taste for mercy that did not feel like defeat. Jon stood with the sand snakes on a ridge at dusk and listened to them speak about the way the sand holds heat into the night. He said that snow holds cold into the day and how to dress for that. Nymeria showed him how to wrap his scarf so his breath did not wet the cloth and freeze his own face. He laughed when the lesson clicked and realized that he was being taught something softer than survival. Obara tried his sword with hers and nodded once. "Not bad for a boy who learned from rocks," she said. A letter came from the Citadel, written by a man who had long ago decided the world would continue in an orderly fashion if only one were thorough with one's ink. It was written by Ibros and not by Sam, but it had Sam's warmth in it, like a pocket somebody had left a hand in. It spoke of plagues that had not come this year and might come next, and of how to avoid them. It spoke of grain storage in ways that made stewards sit up straighter. It spoke delicately of legitimacy and history and the way names lodge in a people like thorns. It did not say what it did not have to, that the story of Jon Snow had come to the Citadel by a careful path and had been written down in a place that makes truth slow but impossible to turn away. Daenerys read it and held the page for a moment longer than a queen needs to hold paper. She gave it to Jon without ceremony, because ceremony weakens some kinds of truth. He read, and his face did not change quickly. Crossed a river and did not get its feet wet. He handed it back. "I will not speak this to men who want to use it more than they want to understand it," he said. "Not until there is a world that can hear it without breaking. Then we will build that world," she said, and found she meant it in the simplest way, the way a woman means she will dig a ditch and plant a seed and put water in a cup for a child. There was no march on King's Landing yet. War learns patience, given enough dead to teach it. They tightened the cordon around Cersei instead. The Reach gave grudging bread under the hands of men who had learned by hunger. The Riverlands watched with eyes that had cried too much and would cry no more and fed soldiers without particularly wanting to know their names. The Stormlands discovered that Dorne could send water uphill in the form of promises and did not hate them for it. Ships went out of Planky Town with 2 flags. One that lied to the wind and one that told the truth to men who knew how to read. Euron tried for the stepstones and found serpents there he had not counted on. The clever little boats Yara had taught to bite and let go. The scorpion on a raft that shot its mouth while a woman laughed and paddled with one hand. He lost 3 ships to things he could not sing at and hurt with the right amount of contempt, and one to a storm that had not been meant for him at all. He went back and smiled and told Cersei that gods had tried to keep him from her bed and had failed. She did not care which ones. Gendry's forge in Sunspear became a little shrine. Men came and watched Dragonglass be persuaded into forms that wanted to hold. Children came and stared at the way sparks fly. He taught 2 boys and 1 girl to grind without cracking. He set a line of spearheads out on a shelf and took a breath and thought of the life he had been born to and the one he had taken. He missed Davos when the man was not there and pretended not to when he was. Missandei wrote laws that began with food and ended with debt, and she did it with clauses that made the rich be clever for the poor if they wanted to remain clever for themselves. Grey Worm took companies inland to escort grain and returned without flourish. He learned the name of a river and pronounced it better the second time. He learned the way a child's shoulders relax when they begin to believe that soldiers are merely men who do difficult work where you can see them rather than monsters who go where they like. He began to sleep without waking at every scrape of a branch. At night, sometimes, Daenerys walked alone as far as a queen can, which is to say not far at all, and stood where a balustrade kept the sea from rushing into the garden. The moon measured itself against the water and lost. She thought of Viserion and let the grief be simple and not a sign. She thought of the way men had looked at her after the gods would, and how it had felt like being handed a coat one is not sure one has earned. She thought of her brother, and then made herself think of him as a boy and not as a man who had given kindness so little room to grow that it had died. She thought of Jon because she could not think of him. She let herself think of him until the thinking was tidy and not a tide. Then morning came as morning does. It made the water gardens shine and the salt sting and the ink dry. It made children bring oranges to sell and men argue about fish. It made the dragons yawn like cats and stretch the world into a shape they could fly in. It brought more letters and more plans and more of the small honest work that becomes history when done enough times in a row. It brought, eventually, the knowledge that the last war comes not when you are ready but when you have arranged enough of your house to make it worth saving. The city that waited for them had grown new bristles. Scorpions sprouted on the walls like a disease that loves wood. The river had been choked in places with floating barriers that fishermen swore at and polite gentlemen praised as the price of civilization. The poorer wards smelled of hunger and salt. The richer ones smelled of new varnish and fear. Cersei sat in her high room and let Qyburn read her the numbers that made her feel for an hour that the world metered itself to her will like wine from a jar. When Daenerys finally stood again in sight of King's Landing's brown river and peeling paint, she did not think of Aegon or Rhaenys or the beautiful queen with her bright eyes whom scorpion bolts had found and brought down. She thought of the boy in the water gardens who would not ask for help until he fell, and of how he had laughed when he stood up again. She thought of the way the dead had been persuaded to lie down and stay there. She thought of oranges. She flew low first, not to show off but to see. She traced the line of the walls and marked where the scorpions could bear on her and where they could not. She saw the faces of men at the triggers and the way their hands shook, and like that, even men who hold a lever that may kill a queen still need to swallow. She came away and sat her counsel. "We will not burn the city," she said. She did not have to say it loudly. "We will break the hands that point the bolts. We will cut the ropes, soak the powder, drown the oil. We will send men who know alleys better than captains know parade grounds. We will take the gates with rope and breath and the knowledge that hunger walks behind and does not want to be tripped. We will ask the city for itself, and if it gives itself we will protect it. And if it holds out we will remind it that the sea and the sky both like me better than they like those who hold them now." Tyrion closed his eyes and opened them again, and looked at her with something like pride and something like the gravity that attends pride when it knows it is stepping into work. "We will need small men and women with big opinions. I know where to find some." "Bronn?" Davos asked. "Among others," Tyrion said. "The city is full of people who love it more than they love the people who currently hold its keys. If you tell them they can keep their city and make them believe it, they will help us open the doors and then tell their children they did it themselves." Jon looked east, where the light turns to sea. "The dead are gone. The living are not better because of it. They are only more themselves." He looked at Daenerys and let the look carry the end of the thought, which can be enough. When at last the night came that was not a true night but the kind armies make by putting out lamps and holding their breath, small boats slipped up in the black water under the quays. Men and women who had not wanted war but had wanted other things that war had come between them and climbed out and went to cut ropes and whisper patchwork plans. A scorpion on the fish market roof creaked and then did not because its arm had been wedged with the right kind of wedge. A pile of jars near the mud gate sprang a leak that smelled like vinegar and righteousness. The gold cloaks found, in the space of a single hand of heartbeats, that half their sergeants were answering to new names. The bells did not ring. That came later in another world. What came first was breath held, and then breath released when a gate opened and there were men in front of it with spears who did not poke. The first Dothraki horse went through the gap like a thought, quiet and sharp. Dornish spears followed, their points lifted so as not to give an enemy the excuse to make a mistake with the first trick of his eye. The Unsullied moved along alleys like certainty. Davos waved men down a street to a little door. He had remembered from selling onions there 20 years before despair learned his address. Gendry stood with a hammer by a door where a man who had taken taxes the wrong way lay tied up with his mouth stuffed with a sock boiled clean. Daenerys held the sky. Drogon breathed only once, at a pile of tar-soaked ropes whose burning made a wall of smoke that the scorpions could not see through. Rhaegal tore a token from the top of the Red Keep and carried it away to show the city that this would be done with surgical jokes, not surgery. Cersei stood in her room and saw the smoke and read it and did not blink. Qyburn arranged his papers with the calm of a man who believes in systems because he cannot believe in souls. Jaime reached the city at dawn with his horse blowing and his cloak the color of a surrender a man hasn't fully admitted to. Bronn found him before the gate because Bronn always found coin before it changed hands. He looked at Jaime's face and shrugged the way a man shrugs when a friend has decided to jump from a height and he has decided not to be the one to tell him the ground is hard. "Come on then," he said. "Let's go find out if you're a story or a proverb." He went into the keep by a servant's corridor that had never learned to like the people who use it. He found Cersei in a hallway that had been built for triumphs and was doing a passable job of holding retreat. He reached for her and she pushed his hand away as if it were a piece of furniture she had stubbed her toe on. "You left me," she said. "I left a lie," he said, and for once the sentence landed with all its weight. This is what comes next. What came next was not what any of them had promised themselves, which is to say it was real. It was doors opening reluctantly and then wider. It was men laying down weapons because their hands had learned they were tired. It was a queen on a high wall, pale, poised, dressed in winter and lies, and another queen in the air, warm, scarred, dressed in dust and intention, and a city below them that had already decided whom it preferred. It was a bolt loosed by a boy who had not meant to, which clattered off stone and killed no one, and another bolt loosed by a man who had meant to, who found at the last that his hand did not want to be part of such a story. So the bolt bent and fell, and the gods did not have to take sides. It was Cersei walking down steps she had walked up as if ascending toward a god, and finding that the god at the top of the stairs was only a room with a chair in it. It was Qyburn turning to say a clever thing and not getting to finish it. It was Euron counting exits and finding fewer than vanity had marked. It was Tyrion standing with Bronn and realizing that some debts can be paid only by adding more to the ledger and hoping the numbers mean something to someone at the end. It was Daenerys landing where the wind makes banners frantic and stepping down with breath in her throat the way a diver steps onto sand and remembers that the world can be held in lungs again. It was Jon coming in at her shoulder, snow still on his boots as if the North had insisted on one last reminder of its claim on him. It was the city quieting, the way a loud room quiets when a baby finally sleeps. Cersei's crown did not fall. Jaime took it from her head because hands that have undone knots remember how they were tied. He held it a moment and looked at it as if it were a small, curious animal that could yet bite. He did not put it on anyone's head. He set it down. In the end, the clang it made was no louder than laying a spoon on a table. There were trials because men like to set chairs and speak in rows. There were sentences because the living believe in the names of things, and punishment is a name they have always loved to understand. There was mercy, harder than justice and heavier to carry. There were feasts where men chewed carefully because the last time they had chewed smiling there had been fire soon after. There were beds where people slept alone because they had learned that sleep is not a group sport, and beds where people slept in company and learned the opposite. Dorne remained Dorne, which is one of the ways a realm can be mended. The Reach sent bread and songs about bread. The Stormlands remembered how to laugh at the sea. The Iron Islands sulked and then rebuilt because sulking is a season there and rebuilding is a trade. The North watched, withholding judgment in the way of men who have learned their judgments are often committees made up of their fathers speaking behind their eyes. Daenerys sat in a room that had never belonged to a Targaryen and had always been theirs, writing a list of the things that make a city live: bread, water, rest, work, fairness, fire, law. She looked at the list and added time. She thought of how often men forget that the last one belongs to them only if they share it. She set the quill down and went to the window. Jon stood in the courtyard below speaking to two boys who had made spears out of sticks and were teaching each other how to play at the dead. He took the sticks and showed them a grip, and then laughed, and then flinched at his own laughter and let it become something warmer. She watched him until he looked up at the window and did not blush at being caught. She raised a hand and thought of a field of white and a plume of flame that had not been enough and had been. She thought of lemon trees and orange blossoms and a dragon pulling his great weight across a lake that had had the indecency to be ice. She thought of a city that had decided not to burn. "My queen," Yora said softly from the door, because he still used the words even here, where the title was not a thing to wave but a burden shared across many backs. "There are fishwives outside who have come to complain. They say the men on the docks look at them with too much interest when they carry their baskets." "Then we will teach the men to look with less interest," Daenerys said, "and to carry the baskets themselves." "Yes," he said, and his smile was a little tired and a little new. "Yes, we will." She went down to meet the fishwives. She went down to meet the day. She went down because this, finally, was the work she had crossed the world to do. To stand where the sea meets stone and people meet kings and all the old oaths are renegotiated into new ones. The air smelled of salt and smoke and oranges and something she could not yet name that tasted like a future. She breathed in and did not tell herself that the breathing itself was victory. She only let it be what it was and then took the next step.